Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this JAN, the Job Accommodation Network, Accommodation Compliance Series webcast, Ask JAN, Q&A, Cognitive and Neurological Team edition. I'm Tracy DeFreitas, and I am a program leader and the Director of Training and Outreach. Today, I will be the moderator for this webcast because I'm joined by my colleagues, Melanie Wetzel, JAN Principal Consultant and Cognitive Neurological Team Lead, and Bill McCollum, Consultant on the Cognitive Neurological Team. Melanie and Bill, thanks for offering this Q&A today. Should be a great opportunity to hear a lot of burning questions on this topic. This webcast is designed to be an interactive discussion about trending job accommodation and Americans with Disabilities Act topics. The team will field questions related to cognitive neurological health conditions, such as mental health conditions, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disabilities, seizure disorders, and neurodiversity. And we'll discuss accommodation topics related to communication, reducing stress and anxiety, and executive functioning difficulties. The webcast will be 60 minutes in duration. Let's get started with the training. Melanie, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. All right, we're going to be brief. Bill and I are going to be real brief today with what we talk about. We have some slides provided. We want to make sure we have plenty of room left for questions because that's what we promised and we want to deliver on what we promised. So Bill's going to talk a little bit about JAN for those of you who may not be as familiar with us and what we do and who we are. We're going to give you a cognitive neurological team overview. The accommodation topics that Tracy mentioned, that's what the slides will be about. And then we're going to have plenty of time for the live Q&A. All right, next slide, please. All right, this is Bill. Thanks, Bill.
Sure. The Job Accommodation Network, that's us, aka JAN. We're the leading source of free, expert, and confidential guidance on job accommodations and, in general disability employment issues. We're a national service established in 1983, so JAN's getting old, just turned 40. So we even predate the ADA. We serve customers across the US and even sometimes around the world with international companies. For 40 years, our mission is to help employers recognize the contributions that qualified workers with disabilities add to the workforce. We do this by consulting on, accommodation solutions, best practices and process strategies, practical guidance on Title I of the ADA, which are the employment provisions of the ADA, and related legislation such as the Rehab Act that covers the accommodation process for federal employees, the FMLA, Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is a relatively new law. We know here at JAN that effective accommodations on the job play a critical role, vital role in making workplaces inclusive, advancing the goals of the ADA, and then ultimately increasing opportunities in the work world for people with disabilities. We are a service provided through the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. We're small. There's only 15 give or take of us consultants, probably less, but federally funded. We operate through West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia. Total staff of about 25 people. So that's JAN. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you. So you may be wondering, what is it we do? Well, we consult on all things cognitive and neurological, and I will get to that in just a minute. We consult with individuals, lots of those, employers, medical professionals, service providers, job coaches, parents, and other family members, coworkers, supervisors and managers, HR people. Adult children will contact us for help with parents who might need help. I even had a contact from a neighbor who was trying to help her neighbor, and I thought that was pretty interesting. Although our mission is to talk mainly to employers, we answer questions, those that we can, from whoever does contact us. So I'm going to give you here a fairly exhaustive list of the conditions that our team consults with, and you will understand why we're so really crazy busy most days. We do all mental health, which includes anxiety, bipolar disorder, depression, eating, personality disorders, phobias, OCD, PTSD, substance use disorders, seasonal affective disorder, schizophrenia, epilepsy and seizure disorders, sleep disorders, autism, ADHD, and neurodiversity, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, learning and intellectual disabilities, Tourette's, stroke, TBI, and post-concussive syndrome. And then also we consult with people who may have MS, multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy, fibromyalgia when there are cognitive issues involved. Sometimes we don't know what the disability is. We have no idea what the medical condition or disability is, but because of the limitations fall under our expertise, we get a lot of calls that are based on memory, let's see, concentration and focus, time management, executive functioning, difficulties, which we're going to talk about here later. And a big one is stress and anxiety, which Bill's going to address here later. We answer a lot of questions about stress and anxiety. Before the pandemic, our mental health calls were increasing on our team. And during the pandemic, it really kind of exploded. A lot of that was anxiety. And since the pandemic, we've had a steady increase in that as well. Okay, so enough about that. So here, our next slide. These are the topics we're going to cover. Tracy mentioned them earlier: mental health conditions, learning disabilities, seizure disorders, neurodiversity, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, reducing stress and anxiety, huge issue, something we talk about multiple times daily, the whole team, executive functioning difficulties, which involves a lot of different medical conditions and disabilities, and communication. All right, next slide, please. And these are the next couple slides are going to be our common topics. All right, next slide. I'm going to talk about mental health first. All right, and I said we're going to be brief. You know, accommodations are always provided on a case-by-case basis based on the limitations that the person has. We can have a lot of people with the same disability. They're going to have similar limitations, but they're going to be different. They're going to be different in levels of severity. And it depends a lot on the job and what the difficulties they're having on the job. And so there can be a really wide range of accommodations available. Some of the most common ones we see are needed for memory, for concentration, for reducing stress and anxiety, and then flexible scheduling. Flexible scheduling is one of the most commonly requested accommodations, and that can mean about anything that helps the employee as long as it works for the employer. We do have our publications linked at the bottom of the slides. We have one that's on mental health conditions. That's a general publication on general mental health. And then if you look there, when you link up to the A to Z of disabilities, that'll give you the page of all disability publications that we have. And there you can find specific ones on bipolar and depression and anxiety and phobias. You can also find their epilepsy and learning disabilities, all those that we have mentioned. And in each slide, we're going to answer a question, a common question to get us started. So the common question that we get is we get a lot of questions about the interactive process, how that's supposed to work. What does that really mean? And so the question is, how can the interactive process be as stress-free as possible? And I'm going to say there's mainly one word I could say would be communication. And the second word would be communicate quickly. You know, I think a lot of questions that we get from individuals is they've heard nothing back from their employer. And if you have a mental health condition, if you have anxiety, and you hear nothing back, that's going to exacerbate your anxiety because you don't know what's going on. And so if the employer can get back as quickly as possible to the employee and say, hey, we got your request, we're working on it. Hey, we got your request, we're sorry to hear you're having difficulty. Go ahead and talk about your process. Even if you have your process written somewhere and you expect people to know what that is, you can go ahead and reiterate that to the employee to ease their stress or their discomfort, or just to help them know what's going on. You know, when an employee discloses, they give out that confidential information, which can be very difficult. They don't know really where it's going, who's looking at it, or what's happened to it. And sometimes we hear it's been 4-6 weeks and they've not heard back from their employer. And that's really way too long. The employer should get back as quickly as possible. I don't know why that can't be done in a couple of days maybe, and just say, hey, we did get your request. You know, our policy is to meet within 7 business days and start the interactive process. And then that way the employee is aware of what's going on and they're not thinking things like, they haven't responded, did they get it? You know, are they ignoring me? Are they going to fire me? They don't have a chance to think those thoughts because nothing's happening. This way they know for sure. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about learning disabilities. Learning disabilities are when there's difficulty with thinking and processing information and remembering, and of course, learning. People with learning disabilities have average to high average IQs and abilities. And so sometimes it takes an employer by surprise because they may have gone through an interview, they may have, talked a lot to a person, and they have no idea that processing difficulty is going on until there's maybe some work product going on, and it can be very surprising to an employer. So there are different issues with learning, with executive functions, which are involve memory and concentration, organizing, prioritizing, multitasking. And there can definitely be issues with reading, writing, and spelling, and mathematics. And there are different diagnoses of learning disabilities. People will say, well, I have dyslexia, and you don't have that on your website. Well, dyslexia, dysgraphia, which is writing, dyscalculia, which is mathematics, disabilities in those areas, they're all listed under our publication of learning disabilities because that's the big umbrella. And then there's specific reading disabilities as well. We have a publication there on learning disabilities. And our question in this category is, how is the documentation of a learning disability different than that of a medical condition? Okay, so I had a question just this morning. The doctor, the employee's primary care physician would not give them documentation for a learning disability. That's because he can't. Learning disabilities are diagnosed through testing, and it's extensive testing, and that's done by an educational or a neuropsychologist, and they write a big report. A lot of that information is not necessary to the employer. But the employee, the individual who was tested will get that report. They test IQ, they test achievement, they look at the discrepancy between the two to figure out what's going on. There'll be a page that'll have strengths and weaknesses. There'll be a page that has recommendations. And that's the medical documentation. You can't just go to your doctor in a 15-minute appointment and say, hey, I think I have a learning disability. Can you verify that and write me a note? It's not how that works. And another thing about it is if the testing was done when a student was 18 or senior in high school or done in college, that's considered current medical documentation because a learning disability is static. It's not going to change over time. They don't need to be tested every year. Some employers will say, well, we needed updated information. Well, that's 3 years old. Exactly. And it's not going to change. So sending somebody to get another test done, that extensive testing, it's very expensive. Insurance doesn't always pay for that. And so that information should be considered current unless there's something that the employer sees that doesn't mesh with what is in that report or the information that they have. And in our learning disabilities publication, if you go down to the bottom of that, we do have a publication specifically on medical documentation for a learning disability. And all of our publications, if you go down, you'll find all kinds of related articles and publications that'll be very helpful. All right, Tracy, what questions do we have?
All right, give me 1 second to take a look here. I'm going to get to this next slide here and see what we have. Okay, so here's one, Melanie. When requesting an accommodation, does the employee need to understand how their disability affects their work? And there's a second question with that. How can a service provider help to determine this for them?
Well, I would say it would be ideal if they know how their disability affects their ability to do their job, but people don't always know that. When we're talking about mental health conditions, whether it's the condition itself or the medication, the side effects of medication, possibly learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, people aren't always aware of their own thinking, their own cognition. They're not aware they might not be doing the whole job. I try to talk about this in every presentation because that cognitive disability keeps them from knowing sometimes that they're not keeping up with their work, that they don't know the whole scope of the job. There's a part over here I haven't been doing. And so they might need help with that. And I think medical providers that are specialists who know the employee might be able to really help with that. Having a discussion with the doctor. Here's what I'm having trouble with. And the doctor can look at that. The doctors can't always provide detailed information about that because they don't really know the job. So I think it really should be the employee who knows themselves and knows their disability, talking with the employer, specifically the manager and the supervisor who knows the job, to help figure out what can we do. How can we help this employee? If you were going to, do a performance evaluation or a performance improvement plan, you would have specifics on where the employee's not doing the work, where they're not up to speed, and you could start with that. Here's where you are, here's where you need to be. Let's talk about how we help you get there. What are your difficulties? And help draw that out of the employee because they may not really be able to see that on their own.
Okay. Here's another one. This is related to learning disability paperwork, because so it's related to what you're just talking about. It says, what if the learning disability paperwork is from when an employee was in school and only applies to school-related activities such as testing? In that case, shouldn't we request updated medical information as it relates to the job?
If there's only information about testing, then that was probably the only modifications that student needed in school. I can't say for certain. I was a special ed teacher before I came to Jan. I couldn't say for certain. But yes, you might be able to request new information if there's nothing that relates to the job. Now, if an employee needs extra time for testing because of reading difficulty, then you can translate that they're going to need extra time or need some assistance with reading on the job. If they need extra time because of distractions, sometimes it's listed like that, then that helps you understand that they have distractions that could affect them in the job too. It could be enough to go on and kind of start with and draw the employee out. In our publication, we do have some ways for people to get that testing done through VR, possibly at no cost, or through a university at a sliding scale fee. As sometimes I had a question just earlier this week about an IEP, which is an individualized education program plan that has a lot of information about modifications. And that sometimes is enough because it might give you details about what they need for reading, what they need for writing, but it may not give you a complete picture.
Okay, very, very helpful. All right, let's see here. So here's something else. Can you talk a little bit about training accommodations and how long an employer would have to provide that type of accommodation?
Okay, sure. That's a question we get a lot. We get frequently too. Because people with disabilities, I'm thinking particularly learning disabilities, they have trouble learning. And a lot of people say, I just need a little extra time. Once I get it, I'm good to go. And that can very well be true. Employers may have policies where they'll say, well, we only provide 2 weeks of training, and then you're out there, we throw you in on the sales floor or on the telephone or whatever the task is. But they really need to look at modifying that policy for someone with a disability and saying, how much time can we allow for some extra training? Do we have to have that person right out on the sales floor today? Can we give them an extra week? Can we give them 2 extra days? And then you need to talk to that employee too to find out, what is it about the training that may not have been as successful? Are there alternate forms that could be helpful to get them up to speed? And then you would determine from your own business need how much time you could allow for them to have extra training, more time with a trainer, different types of materials. Like I said before, I remember talking to an employer one time. They had been training for 18 months. That's a long time, and to have an employee not do the job. Another thing to do is look at how much progress the person's making. If they're making progress, then that's promising that, if we give more training, they're going to progress more. But if they're making no progress and you've given a lot of extra training and a lot of accommodations with that, that may be indicative that, how much longer are we going to do this and still not have any progress?
All right, so helpful. Let's see here. I think we'll do one more, and then we'll continue with the presentation because we'll still have lots of time to answer questions. So let's see if an employee has requested reasonable accommodations and they've not been provided those accommodations, can they be written up for failure to perform the work duties?
Bill, would you like to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if with performance issues, obviously the goal of the accommodation is to allow that individual to work up to expected performance standards. Employers generally don't have to eliminate or lower expectations of performance or production. So, oftentimes, employees do not disclose until there is a performance problem. And at that point, an employer doesn't have to rescind any previous action or rescind a performance plan, improvement plan, or whatever it might be. But guidance urges employers to maybe put a plan on hold until you can see what accommodations might be effective and allow that employee the opportunity, to work with accommodations in place before, before action is taken. It may be punitive or otherwise set the employee back in some way. So, really the employers are urged to act, with some expediency. There's no timelines established, but you do want to at least make a good faith effort to implement accommodations and try those before, there's punitive or other measures taken against an employee who has requested accommodation.
All right, very helpful. Thanks, Bill. All right, let's scoot to the next slide and I'll keep looking for questions.
All right, Bill's going to start in on the next two slides here.
So yeah, our team often gets referred to as the mental health team, but obviously cognitive neurological conditions encompass other things like epilepsy and seizure disorders, which is a pretty wide-ranging condition. There's various types of seizures. A lot of folks typically think of seizures in the form of someone, on the floor seizing, convulsions or whatever. But there's other types of seizures that I'm sure many of you are aware of, where maybe it's just the person sort of phases out for a minute. So, we get a lot of epilepsy seizure calls. Obviously, one of the primary concerns for employers in particular is the safety issue. What are the risks of this if this person has a seizure on the job? And obviously that depends on the type of job it is. You know, in some work situations, there's no like immediate risk except for maybe that employee's health individually. But so safety concerns are, we get a lot of questions about that. Attendance, oftentimes for treatment, oftentimes people who have a seizure, the cognitive effects of that may linger for, anywhere from a short period of time, an hour or so, or even be for some people, we talk with, it could be a couple days. And so they tend to miss a lot of work in some of those situations. So attendance issues, employers are not required to, eliminate all, time and requirements, but they're certainly urged to have some flexibility around attendance policies and need for whether it be just some intermittent leave or short-term leave. Stress management, stress of different kinds is often a trigger for seizures. So managing the stressors that might trigger someone's seizure, sometimes it could be lighting, uh, changing fluorescent lights. There's a number of different ways to do that. Sometimes it is the schedule. There's a lot of calls in this category we get about people shift work and how someone with a certain seizure condition might need a more regular schedule and may not be able to work night shifts or whatever that might be. So those are accommodations to consider. And then driving and traveling, obviously, in many cases, people with this type of condition can't drive a vehicle. So accommodations around the commute, like maybe changing someone's schedule to make the use of public transportation or carpooling more available to the person. And then, of course, if the job requires the operation of equipment or vehicles, that's oftentimes an issue. So what's the best timing for disclosure related to epilepsy and seizures? Really, as with any accommodation need or any condition, the moment an employee knows that the seizure is an issue and might cause a problem, they should disclose. Or if their seizures are of such a nature and severity that it's important for people that they work with to know so they can have a plan in place. It just depends on the condition itself. And I think I always urge people who call about epilepsy and seizures to really get good medical documentation, because about the nature, the frequency, the range of seizures can be very dramatic. Some people hardly ever have seizures and they're treated, it's under control. Some people have frequent seizures. Sometimes it just comes on suddenly. So disclosure is a very personal decision, but if there is any safety risk, or that you're going to need some leave time or attendance flexibility, that's the time to disclose, and not wait until there is a problem, to where there's some risk to yourself or others, or to the individual or others, and to be sure that you're not going to get maybe written up, quote unquote, for attendance issues or whatever. So the time to disclose that is when before the problem happens.
And I like to look at it as a teacher before I came to Jan. When we had a fire alarm or a fire drill, if we knew ahead of time, it was way helpful. And sometimes when you didn't and it just happened, it was very scary because you didn't know if it was real. You're responsible for these kids. And so I think for an employer to know ahead of time and have that plan of action so they know what to do, they know what to expect, they know what kind of care to give the person or not, is very helpful. And I know a lot of individuals have been discriminated against because they have disclosed, but I really feel Bill, exactly what you were saying. If there's any kind of a safety issue or an accommodation that's needed, it's really helpful to have that employer know so that they're prepared.
And part of that's why it's probably good practice for employers to generally let all employees know about their right to accommodation. And so an employee who may need to disclose feels a little safer in doing so. Mm-hmm. Because there is often a reluctance because of the fear of being discriminated against, and unfortunately, because it happens. But I had another piece I wanted to mention. Oh, so one of the common issues we have with epilepsy and seizure disorders, obviously, like Melanie mentioned, because of the safety concerns, and we encourage people to have a plan of action in place. But employers often want to know, well, how, who can I disclose this to, in terms of colleagues, coworkers, whatnot. And that gets tricky because employers are not, under the guidance, they're not to disclose that individuals is receiving an accommodation of any kind, because obviously that, puts some privacy and confidentiality at risk in terms of their health conditions and health information. So, you consider it kind of on a need to know type basis, and sometimes it's okay for first aid or safety personnel, if that is a resource available at an employer's work site, to that they know a person has this condition, and of course the individual themselves can always disclose it to coworkers, which is not uncommon, but that's always an issue. Tricky issue is how do you, because I had a call recently. It was a small law firm, and the woman who I was speaking with wanted, she felt like, well, other people need to know because I'm not always here, but it's kind of up to the employee to disclose that to, coworkers or colleagues. And of course, sometimes the employee themselves will say something like, if I have a seizure, don't call an ambulance or don't call whatever. And that gets tricky too, because you as an employer, you don't want to take that health risk just trusting what the employee said. If you feel like there is a need for emergency intervention, medical intervention, there probably is an obligation to reach out for treatment if necessary.
Bill and Melanie, we have a question kind of around this topic, if you don't mind. I thought I'd throw
Sure.
it out here since you're on this topic. So here, an employee with seizures and narcolepsy requests that they're not left alone for longer than 5 minutes, and they request that coworkers call 911 if a seizure lasts for longer than 5 minutes. So sort of the opposite of what you just
Right.
said,
Absolutely.
somebody's asking for this. And so the question is asking, is this something that's a reasonable request?
I guess I would say, I mean, we can't really say specifically what's reasonable or not in a given situation. In many work situations, that may not be at all feasible in terms of staffing resources for the employee to never be alone. So again, that's an assessment the employer would have to make based on, specific job related reasons, in that case, is it at all feasible for that person to always be in the presence of others? And that will vary depending on, on the work environment and the resources that employer has. I mean, certainly if an employee has requested specific medical intervention, obviously an employer should keep that in mind. But I go back to the good medical documentation and maybe getting good information from the employee's medical provider that gives you some framework of how to set parameters around when the emergency intervention may be required. Confirm that with their individual provider.
And I think it too depends on what those other employees are doing, because you don't have to use other employees to accommodate a
Right.
coworker. And are they busy? Are they going to be able to just keep a
Yeah.
vigilance on this employee every couple minutes to check and to check and to check? And what happens if they don't? What happens if they get busy doing
Yeah.
their work and they don't see something? That's a lot of responsibility to put on employees.
Yeah, I guess you would want to be careful about, obviously assuring someone is not alone is one thing, but putting the burden, like Melanie said, you can't use other employees to accommodate someone. So, employers would have to be careful about putting some kind of burden on those other employees for monitoring or even providing intervention, because there are a lot of risks there. But there's a difference between that and making sure the employee's not alone.
All right, are we ready to
And
move to the next slide?
sure. So neurodiversity is probably a term that you're hearing more and more. All of us are. It's sort of a concept to describe just the range of brain function and behavioral traits that humans experience. The concept is meant to sort of argue that that this is a normal range of the human condition. These varieties in how our brains function and respond to stimuli, certain behavioral traits. It's typically often used to refer to folks who are on the autism spectrum, and often with people with ADD or ADHD. But it does also encompass, whether it's developmental or intellectual disabilities, some mental health conditions, learning disabilities, which Melanie discussed. So it's just about that whole range of human, cognitive neurological response to life and living. Often a lot of the common challenges are usually related to a lot of social interaction, ability to organize, just general cognitive issues, but also, a lot of management of stressors and, triggers in the environment. The Melanie likes to use the phrase, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, because the range of how the condition, that diagnosis is a whole different ballgame than the range of different behaviors and different uh, functionality of how people who are neurodiverse operate. Um, so, some types of effective accommodations often are mentoring. Basically kind of coaching someone through whatever problem it might be, whether that be social skills and communication skills. Sometimes it's telework because a divergent individual may want to have better control over their environment. It could be job restructuring to where an employer alters how and when an employee does certain functions. You don't have to eliminate essential job functions, but sometimes, redistributing or otherwise changing marginal job functions, or even changing how essential job functions are done is often effective. And then, of course, modifying policies, whether that be scheduling issues again, or maybe it could be operating procedures and changing, how maybe tasks are assigned or how people communicate certain needs or what are in the workplace. So modifying how things work in that regard is often helpful. So, we got a question on there of what are some common accommodations for hiring and interviewing? That's often a challenging and very anxiety laden issue for neurodivergent folks who may have autism or other disorders. So different things that can be done during the interviewing and application process is perhaps, oftentimes employers will have multiple people in on interviews. I mean, I've been in interviews where there's been anywhere from 4 to 7 people. So one solution might be to limit that, if that 4 or 5 people interviewing this one individual could be overstimulating and create some issues. So maybe reducing the number of people present in an interview. Maybe an employer allows for a phone interview to take place before and then face-to-face interviews. So, that might help ease the anxiety and stress that individual feels. Or sometimes, an employer might provide some potential interview questions in writing so the person can prep, and feel less anxious when they enter the interview. So these are some different ways. Sometimes presenting things in just different formats is also, which Melanie mentioned with training and learning disabilities. So that's a pretty common accommodation at times. So I think we're ready for any other questions.
All right, this hour is flying by, so let's definitely try to get some other questions in here. Let's see. An employee stated that they need to work from home due to overstimulation, and the healthcare provider note says the same with no details. How do we proceed with that type of situation?
There is a standard and guidance for, what the EEOC describes as sufficient documentation, and that's not just to confirm the need for an accommodation, but it also, good information helps you find an effective solution. So we get this telework question a lot, if telework is not possible, or at least 100% remote work not possible, an employer would want to get more sufficient documentation that describes the type of stimuli that might create a problem for that employee and be overstimulating. Certainly people with autism, it is often issues like noise or lights, but it is also often interpersonal communication. So, or interpersonal interactions. So if telework's not possible, you need more information to get an idea of, okay, besides being able to control your home environment, what stimuli are you trying to control that's interfering with your ability to function effectively, in terms of your work-related tasks. Mm-hmm. So you'd want to identify, and target those things. So maybe an individual, if they can't work from home, their workstation is moved to a place where that helps reduce or diminish those stimuli and that create the problem. And oftentimes it is things like mentoring and coaching and training to help a person get more comfortable and work through things that might disrupt their ability to function. Anything else need to add there, Melanie? Or
Well, I just always say, Bill's was going to talk about this later too, with stress and anxiety. Same thing. People say they have too much stress. What does that mean exactly? Because the employer can't accommodate what they don't understand. And just saying I have too much stress or I'm overstimulated can mean a lot of things. And so in order to reduce those things as accommodations, the employer has to know what they are.
And oftentimes you don't necessarily need to go back or have the employee go back to get, information from the provider. This goes back to the beginning where Melanie was talking about good communication in the process and making an employee feel comfortable. You might just need to have a more practical conversation with that employee about the things that sort of trigger a stress response or cause anxiety for them or just otherwise interrupt their executive functioning or other general cognition.
Right. The EEOC always says never overlook a full conversation with the employee, because if you have to get that medical documentation, the doctor has to get it from the individual. So it's just easier to get it from the individual. They're the ones who experience that. They're the ones who should know.
All right, how about another question? Uh, this one here, do you have a recommendation to accommodate an employee who's requesting to use a voice recorder to help with memory issues? So in this case, the person has a concern of a voice recorder being used when a client's private and confidential information is being discussed. I feel like this is something we often hear.
Yeah, I mean that's a specific job related concern that you would have to address if recording conversations is potentially a violation of client or customer confidentiality or puts their personal information at risk. Obviously, that's a concern an employer has to address. So, certainly with any accommodation, an employer can put some rules and parameters around an accommodation. So maybe the voice recorder is only used in a certain manner, but also with assistive technology, which I'm far from an expert on, I'm learning more and more as I read through things. There's always new things available and new tools, new apps for smartphones or computers. So it's worth exploring maybe with Jan. You can call us and we can help you explore some of the options that are out there. But also every state has an assistive technology project that should help match individuals with assistive technology tools. And sometimes they'll have loan programs where things can be tested to see if it would be effective for that person or not, without having to invest into the cost of something that you buy and then it doesn't really help. So, so certainly if there's concerns about, how recording certain things, and an employer might be able to look at that under the undue hardship standards because of the potential violation to customers or clients. So I'm not sure I hit that on, but I don't know if you
Well,
want
the
to.
only thing I would add is I call it an advanced organizer, and that is just a tool. It's an old school low tech paper. You could have it on an iPad or something like a little form, but you could even have it personalized for each different meeting or client, where you have as much information on a paper going into a meeting, so that when you fill that information out, you have to fill in the least amount of information. And that could be what you do if you can't use a recorder in a highly confidential situation. And maybe you can't write information down at all. I don't know. I mean, some information you'd have to be able to use. But I think if the employee can have some assistance working up a form where they have for meetings with clients, or it's just meetings within their own company, team meetings or whatever, where they have as much information on a page and then they can just fill it in. If that's not overburdening to be taking a bunch of notes all the time, that's very difficult. Executive functioning skills, you're trying to listen, you're trying to write, you're trying to hear what's coming next, and that it can be very taxing. So that's a low tech suggestion.
Yeah, technology doesn't have to be high tech all the time. Basic technologies like paper are often a good.
All right, we have about 7 or 8 minutes or so left for content, so I will skip over to the next slide. But if you all would just like to skip to questions, that's okay too. You just let me know how you want to do this.
I say if we have questions, let's just skip to the questions.
All
Is that
right.
all right with you, Bill?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, let's do that then. All right, so here we go. Here's one related to leave. So, if a person has both a chronic mental health condition and episodic fluctuations in their ability to attend work without proper health care, are they able to request extra leave to attend medical appointments, such as regular mental health counseling?
Yeah, I mean, leave is a recognized form of accommodation, generally speaking. And unlike laws like the FMLA, there's no established amount of leave that employers are required under the ADA to allow an employee in terms of an accommodation. So it really, again, it comes down to analyzing things case by case and determining what amount of leave ultimately would create a hardship for the employer. And leave as an accommodation doesn't have to be paid leave. Obviously, if the employee has paid benefits in the form of leave available to them, they can use that. But if they've exhausted that leave, exhausted maybe FMLA leave if they were eligible, then employers do have an obligation to consider additional leave. And again, maybe some flexibility around attendance requirements, like flexing someone's schedule so they don't have to use or take leave to attend appointments. And obviously, again, that depends on the type of work. If the person's a receptionist and the phones are open 8 to 5, there's not much flexibility in that time. But of course, there are a lot of jobs where there is some more flexibility. Uh, that are, and if an employee misses an hour here, a half hour there, that they can flex their schedule to make up that time. And obviously that'll depend on some of your policies and making sure they're applied consistently. But we can't tell you what amount of leave is a hardship, but some things to consider are, how many employees do that same job? Is it a specialized position? But then, consider what's the cost of recruiting, hiring, training a new employee if in that position. Factor that into how long you think you might be able to allow leave. But again, it's just about that case by case analysis.
All
You can
right.
always provide it on a trial basis and see, is it going to, if you're not sure, is it going to create a hardship or not? We're not sure. Let's try it and see. And if it doesn't, continue it. And if it does, then, convene back and figure something else out.
And just to kind of follow up on that, Melanie, if someone were to have an accommodation for intermittent leave for flare-ups of anxiety or depression, there's a question about whether that should be FMLA or whether it should be FMLA and ADA. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, from what I understand, and we're not FMLA specialists, FMLA provides more protection, and employers are encouraged to use FMLA first if somebody qualifies for that. If they don't, then they apply the ADA. And then if they qualify for FMLA, then they use the ADA leave when the FMLA has been exhausted. We get a lot of calls about, I don't want FMLA, I want ADA. I don't understand that, because FMLA does provide more protection, because an employer can't take an action against FMLA use, but they can determine under ADA if it's too much, it's a hardship, and they can't provide that anymore. So that's the way I understand that. It should be FMLA first if they qualify, and then ADA once they exhaust that, or if they don't qualify for FMLA.
All right. Here's a question around neurodiversity. So, for the purposes of neurodiversity, how would an employer know in an interview process if an applicant doesn't disclose they may have autism? How might they handle that?
Well, they're
You might not know.
likely not. It just depends. They're likely not going to know. If there are clues to the employer, the interviewer, that something's going on, the employee's having difficulty, they can ask, hey, how do we help you? What do you need? They can go that route in an interview. If somebody is looking like they're having some kind of distress or having difficulty, they can slow down the process, give the person time to answer questions. That's sometimes, if you have any kind of anxiety, like Bill mentioned, an interview is going to create a lot more stress, I think, for all of us. But it can cause you to freeze up. You may not be able to answer questions as quickly. And or the interviewer may be able to see that in the applicant and kind of slow down that process, give him time, say, take your time. even if somebody's struggling, even maybe try to rephrase the question so it comes across in a different way, so that the employee or the applicant then has a kind of version of that question, maybe.
Okay, I
And of
think,
course, employers get reluctant because of the concerns around medical inquiry and in the ADA. You don't always have to, directly ask, if there's something you feel is going on, you can just take the broad approach of it, is there anything we can do to help you or assist you? And that doesn't really ask for any medical information, but it might invite that employee to disclose something that could be helpful to both parties going forward.
okay, here is another question. Let's see, what can we do for an employee with ADHD who cannot work in an open environment, but everyone works in an open environment?
Oh, that's a really good question, because we there for a while we saw a lot of that. It seemed like everybody was going to an open environment. That doesn't work for a lot of people, disability or not. So you want to look at what is it about that open environment that's most problematic? Is it the sound? Is it are there distractions? Is the person facing the middle of the room? Is everybody moving around? And I think to have some guidelines in place, um, that it's, even though it's an open environment, there's still work going on. People need to kind of be quiet, not just carrying on all the time. I hear that a lot. It's in an open environment. I can't control the next person over, and they're talking all the time. That's not work related. But look at the employee's difficulties. Can you turn the desk around so he's not facing that? Can you put up a partition? And they say, well, we don't want to draw attention to him. Okay. But I think having that conversation with the employee, what is it you need? Let's talk about how we might be able to do that. Can we move this employee someplace else? Not to isolate them, but have that discussion. Would this work better if we moved you over here near the stairs where it's very quiet? You're not going to be with everybody, because most people who want that, they don't care if they're isolated. They want that because it reduces those distractions of noise and movement. Sometimes it's just a lot of movement, and reorienting a desk can help kind of with that, or moving them further away where there's no sound, or the sound is reduced. Headphones, anything, a white noise machine or something like that can help. An app on their phone might be able to help one earbud where the other ear kind of hears what's going on. For some people that works. Music. But I think you want to talk to the employee, because you don't want to assume that, hey, if we move them clear down underneath the stairs, that's going to be best for them, because they may feel like, well, gee, that's not exactly what I meant. I don't want to be that isolated. But the employee themselves may have a lot of ideas on what would work in that workplace that the employer hasn't thought of.
Yeah, we get a lot of questions. Well, what are some good accommodations for this? What ADHD or PTSD, but just like Melanie was speaking about there in that type of open environment situation, for some individuals, even two individuals with the same condition, they may be their desk oriented, their workstation in a position where there are no visual distractions. Other people with the same condition might want to be able to see and be aware of everything in their surroundings. So can be highly individualized. So that's, why it's important to have, good practical conversations with the employee, and and try to get into what exactly is causing the stress or the anxiety or the lack of concentration.
Okay, well, this has been great. We still have questions rolling in. We don't have time to get to everyone's question, but I do need just a couple of minutes to close things out today. I will remind everyone, you do have a copy of the slides, and there's some great useful information there you can certainly take advantage of. But also, most importantly, you can certainly contact Jan if you still need your questions answered. That is all the time that we have today. Melanie and Bill, we thank you so much for answering our questions and offering this great information. We do appreciate you. Attendees, if your question was not answered today, remember, again, you can contact us, Ask Jan. You can do that by receiving that direct, free, and confidential consultation. Use the askjan.org website. You can use the live chat feature on our website. You can call us at 800-526-7234 or email us at jan@askjan.org. And if you're not already following us on social media, we ask you to please do that. Find the Job Accommodation Network on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and at Jan on X. Just a reminder again, you can use these slides for some additional information. The purpose of this great Q&A webcast was to certainly answer lots of questions, and we had plenty coming in. So we appreciate everyone for being here with us today and joining us. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone. This concludes our training.